do as they approach Cuba? Well, number one, he told the committee that when a ship got within 800 miles of Cuba, it would be stopped by the United States Navy. So kind of the first step would be the United States Navy would stop any Soviet ship when it got within 800 miles, not of Cuba, but of the quarantine line. Okay? So they're going to put this line, they're not going to do it yet. Kennedy has to do it officially, if he decides even to go this route. But anyway, the procedure would be once a Soviet ship got within 800 miles of the quarantine line, it would be stopped. The second thing that would happen, after they stopped the ship, they would board it and search it, or inspect it. Inspect is a better, less warring word than search. Okay? So the ship would be boarded and inspected. If they found no offensive weapons, what would they do? Let it go through. If they found offensive weapons, what would they do? Most people think that. They simply would tell them to turn around and go home. They wouldn't confiscate the weapons. They wouldn't fire at them. They simply would ask them to go home. Now, if they probably, they refuse to go home, we'll get into that later, they'd probably have a different action. But that's kind of the plan. So McNamara explains that the Navy's going to stop any Soviet ship that's within 800 miles from the quarantine line. They will board that Soviet ship and inspect it, and the vessel was carrying offensive weapons, they would make them turn around and go home. Now, what problem doesn't that solve, kiddos? What? The ones that are already there, right? So why would this strategy even work? What's the hope of this strategy that would solve this crisis? That's right. It shows the jig's up, and we're really hoping that the Soviets go, oh well, it was a good try, but now they know, so we'll just go ahead and voluntarily take those missiles out. Okay, and it's not a bad strategy. I mean, it's possible. Maybe they were trying to sneak them in there, hoping we didn't know. And once they got them ready and operational, then it was a whole different game. But since they didn't have them ready and operational and we found out about it, we were hoping they simply would voluntarily remove their missiles because they didn't want a war with the United States. That was our hope, yeah?
Why couldn't they just say no then? Why did you have to go the whole thing?
Being secretive?
Yeah.
Us, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, we'll get to that. We'll tell you that in a minute. Okay? That's a good question. Now, let me ask you this question. When you ask McNamara, well, what happens if they don't remove all those missiles and we're still under threat and they're still building the missile launching pads? What do we do then? Oh, what would be the common answer? We would airstrike and invade. Well, at that point, CIA Director John McCone just has a fit. And he expresses his absolute opposition to the blockade. He just has a fit. When McNamara says, well, if they don't take them out voluntarily, we'll just airstrike them and invade. What's McCone's concern? Think about it. The other class picked it right up. Why would he be so frustrated with that? What's that?
He's CIA. He's a part of it.
Well, come on.
They can prepare now.
Who could?
The Soviets.
That's exactly right. We lose first strike capability. They know we know, so if we go in an airstrike now, we lose the element of surprise. They know we're going to come, and they prepare for that. And McCone just goes crazy. He says, this blockade's going to eliminate any first strike capability that the United States has. There is no element of surprise. And if they know that we're going to air attack them, what are they going to do? What are they going to do in retaliation of our airstrikes? Or if they know we're coming, what's their response? Most people said, well, they'll go to Berlin. McCone says they aren't going to go to Berlin. They're going to launch those rockets because they'd rather use them than lose them. Okay? So McCone just goes crazy. He says, wait a minute. This isn't going to work. If they don't voluntarily take those missiles out after this blockade, we can't airstrike because they know we're coming, because we know they have missiles in there, right? And we're going to lose first strike capability, and they're going to work hard as they can to get those launching pads operational, and they're going to fire them upon American cities. And he's probably got a pretty good point, right? So all of a sudden now, we're at a bit of a standstill. And this is great. At this point, good old Adlai Stevenson, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, speaks up. Don't write this down, but this is what he says. He says, well, maybe one of us in this room should be a coward, so I guess it'll be me. He's going to suggest a third option, which would be what? Not leave it alone, but strike a deal. Compromise. Strike a deal. So, as now tempers are high, emotions are flying, Adlai Stevenson, the good old diplomat, the good old politician, steps up and says, well, maybe one of us in this room should be a coward, so I guess it'll be me. And he's proposing a third option, striking a deal with the Soviets. What in the world will we strike a deal about? Obviously, we're going to have to give the Soviets something for taking their missiles out of Cuba, right? That's how you strike a deal. What in the world would we give them?
Like stop going to Cuba?
It's only your word. It's good.
Something with Berlin?
Nope.
Stop.
Oh,
Anybody know this?
stop. Oil?
What? What were you going to say?
I was gonna say Berlin.
No? Guess what the United States has placed in Turkey many years ago? Jupiter missiles. Why do you think they put missiles in Cuba? They being the Soviets. Because we already had missiles in Turkey.
Oh my God.
Oh, I'm not kidding you. Those missiles in Turkey were put in there to keep an eye on the Russians, right? Why do you think Khrushchev sent these missiles to Cuba? So they would be even, right? I'm not kidding you, I'm not making this up. So what is Stevenson's option?
Take them out.
Let's trade our missiles in Turkey for these in Cuba. Makes sense. And he also says, you know, Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Anybody know what that is, Guantanamo Bay? Gitmo, what is it? It's a prison for guys in the military that violate the law. That's an American possession in Cuba. We own that today, right? Well, he thinks we should trade Gitmo and the Jupiter missiles in Turkey in exchange for Russia taking the missiles out of Cuba. It makes sense, doesn't it? Why did Kennedy respectfully listen to him and say, Adlai, that's just not possible? And why the other members of ExComm, especially the military, thinking, oh my God, are you kidding me? Why? It makes sense. Oh, it shows we're horrible. What? We're the most powerful country in the world. You think we're going to negotiate with the Soviet Union? You think we're going to show any weakness to those red such and suches? There's no way. Everybody was astonished. Stevenson's trying to come up with a peaceful way of doing this, but it makes us look incredible. You think that General LeMay and General Taylor and Dean Acheson and Walter Sweeney and George Anderson thought that was a good idea? Not one of them thought it was a good idea. Because at that time in our America's history, we kicked butt and took names. We were the most powerful country in the world. We didn't succumb to anybody. Yes?
In Kennedy's inaugurational address speech, he said that we should work together to end the evils of the world, which included war.
Yeah.
So wouldn't that be like
Well,
his
it wouldn't. I don't think you're wrong, but at this time in history, this wasn't the time you were going to back down and negotiate. It wasn't going to happen. And it's really kind of interesting. Keep that thought till later. Now, listen to this. This is where Kennedy has finally said, hey, the buck stops with me. He thanks the committee. He tells the committee that he will think about it for the next 48 hours. And on Monday, October 22nd, he's going to address the nation. And he's going to tell the American people about the crisis in Cuba and what the United States' plan is. He has not made up his mind yet. He doesn't know what he's going to do yet. Ultimately, whose decision will it be? His. So Kennedy informs the committee that he would take some time to explore all the options. He would make a decision on the situation in Cuba. His decision would be relayed to the American people on Monday night, October 22nd, on national television, with the full disclosure to citizens of the United States, the situation in Cuba, and what the United States was going to do about it. To tell you how unsure he was, he asked Theodore Sorensen to write 2 speeches for the meeting. A speech explaining the use of a naval blockade, and a speech explaining airstrikes followed by invasion. Okay? So he didn't know at this point. He had him write 2 speeches with both scenarios. He's going to choose one of the two. Now, have they done a great job of keeping this from the media?
Yeah.
And certainly Kennedy wants to keep this from the media until Monday night, right? Because after Monday night, does he care? No, he doesn't care. And he doesn't want the Russians to know we know until Monday night when he has a plan in action. Okay? So, everything's hunky-dory until later that evening. And Kenneth O'Donnell is at a dinner party. And it just so happens that Adlai Stevenson is at the same dinner party. Okay? So later that evening, Adlai Stevenson and Kenneth O'Donnell have been invited to this dinner party. And they bump into her, and poor old Adlai Stevenson, he said, "Did you ever see anybody commit political suicide like I did there in that meeting today?" And Kenneth was trying to appease him, and, you know, it's okay, Adlai, it was a good thought. I mean, sorry it didn't work out, blah, blah, blah. And finally, Stevenson informs O'Donnell that the New York Times was prepared to run a story about the situation in Cuba in Sunday morning's paper. Somebody had gotten information. And in Sunday morning's paper, they were going to run an article about there's problems in Cuba. That was not good. So, Stevenson informs O'Donnell that the New York Times was prepared to run a story about the situation in Cuba in Sunday morning's paper. Kennedy, does he want that? He's going to speak to him when? Monday night, right? Now you got to remember, these days they ran a morning paper and an evening paper. Okay? The story was going to be written by a columnist by the name of James Reston. James Reston had heard rumors about an invasion of Cuba. And how did he hear about that? What were we doing as we were trying to decide what we were going to do? You think we were preparing troops for an invasion? Certainly were. And there were some unusual troop movements in Florida. And he caught wind of those and surmised that we were going to go invade Cuba. He didn't know for sure, but he thought that was going to happen. And he was going to report that. He was going to report that in the New York Times on Sunday morning, that we were going to invade Cuba. So O'Donnell quickly calls President Kennedy and says, "Hey, we're not going to make it till Monday because the New York Times and James Reston are going to run this article Saturday morning in the New York Times." What did President Kennedy do? He called, very good, he called James Reston and asked him to hold the story. Reston's just a reporter, so he used the old line of what?
What story?
Not my call. I'm not the boss here, I'm just the writer. This is not my call. I cannot hold the story for you. That's not my call. Whose call would it be? Huh? Publisher of the New York Times, Orville Dreyfus. It would be Orville Dreyfus's call. So what does Kennedy do? He calls Orville Dreyfus and tries to persuade him to hold on to Reston's story until after his speech on Monday night. You got to hold off on this story. Do not publish this story. Please. I can't have you publish it. You got to have the guy hold off. And Dreyfus was hesitant. Why?
Because other companies know.
He was asked to hold a similar story way back before what? And decided to do it, and he regretted it ever since. He held a story once before when we had a secret operation going on. Bay of Pigs, very good. He told the president, you know, I held a story for you once before the Bay of Pigs, and it's the worst mistake I ever made because the press makes money by having stories. You don't have papers. You ever read the paper? You ever read anything that good that happens in a big paper? It's always about fires or murders. Or, I mean, I remember one time, I was in a high school. I was the assistant principal in a high school of 1,000 kids. And we put in this new attendance policy that I ran, and 16 kids lost first semester credit. 16 out of 1,000. Is that pretty good? Pretty. That's not. You know what the headline of the paper was the next day after the board meeting? 16 Minico students lose credit for this semester because of attendance. Why, I mean, I called the guy, says 16 out of 1,000, that's your headline? You know what he told me? Sells newspapers. You think people bought that, wanted to read that story? Didn't matter, once they got the paper, they go, oh God, it was only 16 out of 1,000, but they got their attention and they bought the paper. Same thing here. He said, I hesitate on your request because I held a similar story just before the Bay of Pigs invasion and regretted it ever since. And he says, what am I going to tell my reporters who I pay every day to come up with this stuff for our paper? What am I going to tell them if I make them hold this story? What am I going to tell James Reston, who's worked his butt off to get this information? That's what he does for a living. What am I going to tell him? President Kennedy says, quote, tell him he'll be saving lives, including his own. So here's how it went. Dreyfus asked Kennedy what he's going to say to his reporters, who have all worked hard for stories, especially James Reston. And he said, tell them they will be saving lives, including their own. Because he believes if this gets out, we're going to end up in a nuclear war over this thing with Russia. Well, Dreyfus decided to comply with the president's request and hold the story until after his Monday night speech. How about that? Now, I just want you to listen to this real quick, like if you would. I got this on the paper. In 1962, Mr. Reston was apparently the only person who had found out that the Soviet Union, then under the leadership of Nikita S. Khrushchev, had secreted nuclear missiles into Cuba, only 90 miles from Florida. When Kennedy realized that Mr. Reston had the information, he telephoned him directly. 4 years later, Mr. Reston recounted the incident to E. Clifton Daniel, then managing editor of the New York Times. The president told me that he was going on television on Monday night to report to the American people, Mr. Reston recalled. He said if we published the news about the missiles, Khrushchev could actually give him an ultimatum before he went on the air. I told the president I would report to my office in New York, and if my advice was asked, I would recommend we not publish, but it was not my duty to decide. Kennedy then called Mr. Orville Dreyfus, the publisher, and asked him not to print Mr. Reston's article. Mr. Dreyfus left the matter up to Mr. Reston and his staff, and the article was withheld. So he actually asked Reston, you know, he ever had one of those things where the boss asked you to do something, but you really know the answer already, and that's what happened. Pretty interesting. Okay, that'll take us in to Sunday, October 21st, the last day of this information I'm going to give you before we watch the video. And we will start that tomorrow. Okay? So tomorrow we will lecture for about 10 minutes, and we'll start the video, and we'll watch it on what we've talked about thus far. Okay? Pretty interesting, really, but we're only a third of the way through.